Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, depending where you are based from, and welcome to our webinar, Corporate Renewable Energy Transition in Southeast Asia. Thank you for taking a time to join the webinar. My name is Shushan Khachatyan, and I am a Senior Project Manager in Solarplaza, and I will be chairing the webinar with you. So corporate renewable energy in Asia is a topic that is and has been on top of market players' agenda. This year, all of you know already, I started with the news of Microsoft signing an agreement with Sunsip to purchase 100% of renewable energy from solar power plant in Singapore. So you can see the first renewable energy commitments have already been made and many more are expected. But why are parts of Asia slow in developing their renewable energy potential, and what options does corporations have, and what is the short to mid-term outlook? So to explore the renewable energy situation in Asia, the corporate renewable energy situation in Asia, Solarplaza is starting a series of webinars dedicated to this topic. During this webinar, we will look at the market opportunity and bottlenecks for corporations to power their operations by renewable energy. Our first webinar today is focused on Southeast Asia, and our second webinar that will take place exactly in a week is focused on China. And I will tell you the details of the second webinar after our speakers. So I would like to share some practical notes. In case you face any technical issues, please use the chat box at the dashboard. Our technical team will try to help you with your problems. I would like to encourage all of you to ask questions, again using the same chat box at your dashboard. We will have question rounds in the middle of the presentation and at the end of the presentation. So I would really encourage you to be active and share your questions. And the last note, the presentation slides and recordings will be available afterwards. So we will send an email after the webinar with that. For those of you that don't know about Solarplaza, just very briefly, I would like to introduce our company. Solarplaza is a knowledge platform of over 50,000 PV professionals, and we have a goal to accelerate the energy transition. Our main business is organizing high-level conferences and trade missions, and in the past 10 years, we have organized over 80 events in more than 25 countries, both in Europe, US, but also in the emerging markets. Corporate renewable energy will be also a large discussion during our upcoming conference, Unlocking Solar Capital Asia, that will take place 1st and 2nd of November this year. For this year, we are collaborating with Asia Clean Energy Summit. So you have a chance to meet over 1,000 industry representatives, to learn from the expert in the region, to meet the solar PV value chain in Asia, from developers to service providers. Please check our website for more information about the program and registration. With this, I would like to pass the floor to our first speaker. We have two speakers today, Liam Salter, representing the board of ACT Renewables, and Alex Pereira, Deputy Director of World Resources Institute. So I would like to give the floor to Liam, who would present a little bit about the topic today and also present the company. Liam, please, can you hear us?
Yeah, thank you, Shushan.
Yes, great.
So hi, everyone. My name's Liam. I'm a board member at ACT Renewable. I'm also the CEO at Reset Carbon, which is one of the owners of the ACT Renewable business. Just a quick word on ACT Renewable. ACT Renewable is a joint venture between Reset and Baywa RE, which is a renewables project developer. We really set up ACT because we feel that the corporate space is underserviced from a service perspective, and we're really trying to combine the skill sets of the JV partners, which is a sort of a corporate environmental consulting skill set and a technical renewable skill set into one set of sort of specialist pure play services. So that's our perspective. And myself, I'm based in Asia, and Reset has been operating in Asia with a predominantly corporate customer base for 10 years. And so that's the perspective that I'll be bringing to the webinar. Some short overview of our agenda. We're going to keep it pretty focused with Alex today. I will give you a short overview of the sort of the country situation in Southeast Asia, and we'll pause for any questions at that point. Then I'll talk a little bit about the different types of company that we see moving to make procurement decisions around renewables in the region. And Alex will conclude by talking about some of the corporate focused programs that World Resources Institute has been developing in the region. One thing to leave you with at the beginning of this presentation, I think our view here is we're looking at a set of geographies and a set of markets that are still quite early phase. We do feel that the companies that will benefit most from this phase in the market will be those that take a more entrepreneurial position and that look to participate in the creation of these market opportunities rather than those that remain too passive. So as a general observation, I think that's something to bear in mind, and I hope that the rest of our presentation will serve to illustrate that for you. At this point, I'm going to hand it over to Alex, who will give you a geographical rundown of what he's seeing across the Southeast Asian region. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you very much, Liam, and hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. So my name is Alex Pereira. I'm the Deputy Director of WRI's Global Energy Program. I'm based in Washington, but I'm often in all corners of the world, so hard to say exactly where I spend most of my time. But energy is a very important focus of the World Resources Institute. We are a nonprofit development organization, and we really try to seek the win-win solutions between development and climate change. And energy is a great example where we partner with the private sector to find solutions to do that. So next slide. So one way to do that is the partnership that WRI, Allotrope, and the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, that's perfect, has developed called the Clean Energy Investment Accelerator. This program is exactly what it sounds like. We're trying to accelerate clean energy investment in key parts of the world that need to be really engaged for urgent action on climate change. And really a theme that makes this program unique and sort of in the DNA of the World Resources work and in the Clean Energy Investment Accelerator is that we're looking at this from the demand side. So we're working with the large buyers, industry, who represent the vast majority, sometimes 60% of electricity consumption in markets, and looking to find models to make it more attractive for them to source renewables, looking to engage policy, looking to attract financing models. We can get into a little bit more about the CEIA later as we get into some solutions. But I wanted to provide a little bit of a regional overview and some context for why Southeast Asia provides sort of an interesting opportunity for us. Let's skip. Next slide. And one more. Perfect. So not rocket science here, but we've seen some very fast declines in solar PV. This chart is even a little out of date, but you can see, the trends are dropping, and those we continue to find cost savings in PV. And on the bottom, we've seen that translates into increase in power purchase agreements signed by corporates. So what's interesting to note here is up until about, well, really through 2012, sort of into 2013, power purchase agreements were something that were only done in the US and Europe, right? And now all of a sudden we start to see Asia, the slice of Asia getting bigger. So this is a very interesting trend and something we're interested in continuing to help support. Next slide. So, to look at two markets that are both very important for the climate transition, just because of the amount of coal used, and also for the companies that we speak to in both their operations and their supply chains, Indonesia and Vietnam. So, this is just, again, from BNEF, showing current levelized cost of energy. This is BNEF sort of calculates levelized cost over a plant's life. You can go to BNEF to look at more of the assumptions behind these costs, but they're very detailed. But the idea is that this is sort of an apples to apples comparison. And what you see is coal is no longer the best technology in the region. There are other alternatives that are becoming viable. Next slide. And while other alternatives are becoming viable today, the trend is that they've been becoming cheaper. So we anticipate, the cost of wind, solar. These are trends from BNEF in Indonesia and Vietnam. The top two charts are wind, onshore wind, but onshore wind. And you can see the trends are dropping. And for solar, they're dropping very fast. So what's this going to do to the comparison model as we go forward? We're going to anticipate that the alternatives are going to become even more attractive. And next slide. So this slide is very telling because while the alternatives are becoming more attractive, look what's happening to sort of the mainstay staples of electricity generation. So in a country like Vietnam, where 55–60% of electricity generation come from coal and gas, I could show you the exact same trend for gas as well. Indonesia, 50% of electricity generation come from coal, and these technologies, the price of coal is actually going up. So what is that going to do in terms of pressure on rates? So I know in Vietnam, there's a lot of interest in making the utility and sort of a push to finding a way to make the utility more commercially viable and actually having commercially justifiable rates. There's some political concerns about doing that. They just increased prices last December, electricity prices last December, to sort of help with that. But many companies that we talk to are anticipating that rates will increase in the region. And that's going to make it even more imperative to start dipping your toe into how do you hedge that rate increase? What are some of the alternatives? Next slide. So we're seeing that in Vietnam. This chart is from our friends at GIZ. And we can see that, from 2012 to 2016, companies were starting to get into this. Intel did a project in Ho Chi Minh City. It was largely just as an experimental project to see, kind of get used to solar, see how it works in Vietnam. So we sort of went through a learning phase of smaller projects, sort of done for kind of experimental reasons. And now since 2017, we're starting to see larger projects that are actually done on a commercially justifiable basis. And so companies are really starting to see more financing, leasing solutions in Vietnam emerging. We've been talking with many financing providers who all say that they can provide today a solar leasing option that competes with both the industrial and the commercial tariff in Vietnam. So we're starting to see more solutions and innovation in this space. Next slide. And I think, as was mentioned, we're actually seeing this trend continue even across the region outside of Vietnam and Indonesia. So many projects in other countries, like in Thailand, Big C, 27 megawatts across 15 stores in Thailand, right? That's some scale. Apple, Facebook, Microsoft have all done 50+ megawatt deals. So we're starting to see the companies, both multinational and regional companies, get much more sophisticated about how they're looking at this stuff and how they're deploying it. So really exciting momentum. So with that, I think I can stop and take any questions.
So Alex, we have one question coming straight to the point, asking us about the split in PPAs, synthetic versus behind the meter. So roughly, what's the split across the Southeast Asian market for PPAs?
Behind the meter and off-site. So it's a good question. I actually don't have the exact numbers on that, but in most of these markets, I would say it's been on-site, and the regulatory framework is essentially at odds with allowing companies to do off-site PPAs, right? So in Vietnam, and I can talk a little bit more about this later. In Vietnam, our friends at VLEAP are working with the government. We've been supporting them to do this. Are working with the government to create that pilot program in Vietnam that allows companies to do off-site PPAs. And that should be available in the next few months. So that'll be a fantastic opportunity to start getting into the off-site PPA space. But most times we're seeing that companies are doing on-site PPAs just because it's easier. There's less sort of red tape to cut through, and the economics are more favorable.
Yeah, I mean, I would confirm that. I mean, we're looking at a bunch of regulatory structures that simply, haven't pushed the sort of the liberalized market paradigms that far in the region, and in a way, that's really what we are now interested in working on. So what's happening now is we're really seeing a wave of corporate demand that can't be satisfied purely with on-site options. And so I think a lot of the work that Alex and his team are doing, and they're looking at ways of how we can link that demand, bring that demand to the regulators, and look for ways to evolve the opportunities so that we can source from off-site projects. I would say that in all likelihood, in a lot of countries, and not just for Southeast Asia, but certainly looking at China and places like that, we're going to see structures that we perhaps haven't seen in the West, that might be hybrids, or that take into account the role that specific regulatory agencies will continue to play in the deal. But certainly it's probably almost 100% at the moment in terms of behind the meter PPAs.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I think the deal structure follows the form of the regulatory environment. So I think in Indonesia and Vietnam and some of these markets, we are, as you said, Liam, I mean, I think the idea is really to encourage, if there's one takeaway from this, the more we can collaborate with the private sector to engage the utility, engage the regulator in creating that more open, renewable energy friendly regulatory environment, we can create new opportunities for these deal structures. I mean, the economics are very favorable. And that's something we're very interested in doing. And actually, in talking with the governments in Vietnam and in Indonesia, they're very open to hearing from the private sector about what they can do to make some of these open access policies, direct power purchase agreement pilot programs more useful and workable to the private sector. So there's a real openness in collaborating. So it's just a question of putting the pieces together.
So we have another question on the role of RECs and other certificates and how those are being deployed in the region. What do you think about RECs, Alex?
Sure. So WRI has a long history of RECs. We actually, back in 2003, even helped support the first REC purchases in the U.S. through our program called the Green Power Market Development Group. RECs continue. I mean, most companies have sort of moved away from just buying RECs because They want more of the underlying value of sort of the hedge value of the fixed price renewable energy transaction. But RECs are the mechanism by which we account for the green power. You know, if you don't have ownership of the REC, if you don't have a clearly defined REC, if you don't have a mechanism to trade the REC in a credible, transparent way, it's hard to make the accounting claims. So, you know, the REC, and there are a number of companies, you know, APX and others, who are looking at putting in place REC trading systems. I mean, the REC is going to be, you know, sort of the currency by which we account for these transactions. So that's another piece that has to be put in place in these markets.
Yeah, I would say we haven't, from our perspective in Asia, we don't see that many Asian companies making large REC purchases at this point. It sort of, they view it a bit like carbon offsets, and they often sort of regard it as a cost, and they're definitely looking for ways of engaging with renewables that provide them with added forms of value. So I think that's really why the sort of the bundled models, the offsite bundle models, are going to be quite important, because there is a reluctance to sort of just go out and pay for a credential without some other kind of relationship to the project. You know, another interesting feature of RECs is that, you know, and I'm not sure how much this is a formal sort of regulation or how much is a sort of an accepted market trend, but, you know, you tend to want to buy RECs from the country that you're using the power in. And obviously, you know, some countries in Southeast Asia, they don't have that big a REC supply yet. And so for companies that are seeking to do that, they may not have very many options, even if that's all they're interested in. You know, a question back to you on that, Alex. This issue of sourcing RECs from the same geography, is that enshrined in certification protocols, or is it more or less a sort of a thing that people do?
Yeah, I mean, this gets into the weeds of accounting, and I think, you know, we have to check with, if we're reporting to CDP and others, you know, we need to check with them on the guidance that they would require us or request that we use, right, to get the right answers. So I am not an accountant. I don't profess to play an accountant on TV, but we have developed the greenhouse gas protocol and sort of the scope 2 accounting guidelines, which provides some fundamental tools for how you do the accounting. But I think the key point, what I always advise companies on this, is just to be as transparent and clear about what you're doing as possible. And I think there's a lot of good reasons that, you know, you might be based in one country and do a transformative purchase in another that helps support the regional market. And there's a lot of good reasons for why you want to do that. And so, you know, it would be a negative outcome if companies just threw up their hands and said, we're not going to do anything because the accounting is too complicated. I think it's, you know, it's important to encourage that we try to continue to look for attractive models and investment opportunities and ways to support renewables. But, you know, check with CDP about specific accounting rules, and also just be transparent in what you're doing and clear in how you communicate, you know, what you're doing. And if you're buying from another region, say that you're doing that. Just be clear. I think that's the most important rule.
So no more questions at present. Next slide, please.
Everything was totally clear.
Yeah, apparently. Well,
apparently.
Unless somebody writes in to the contrary. So right. I'm going to talk a little bit about you know, what we're seeing in the region in terms of sort of corporate attitudes towards renewables procurement. Next slide, please. What I've done here is I've just, you know, I've pulled out 3 sort of corporate types that we see quite a lot, and I'll just spend a few minutes talking through you know, some of the advantages and challenges that that each of these company types faces, and some of the ways that they appear to be approaching the marketplace, particularly in Southeast Asia at the moment. So one, you know, company type that we do a lot of work with is obviously Asian blue chips. So this would be, you know, large often publicly listed companies listed in Asian exchanges, with a visible kind of corporate brand and reputation, an international business, probably competing against peers from the West in local markets. So examples would be, Swire Group or Siam Cement in Thailand. These companies obviously have one of their strengths is that they know Asian markets very well, and they have a lot of capacity and capability in those markets from both a technical and a procurement perspective, and those markets are important to them. So often, businesses will act in home markets first, and Asia are the home markets for these guys. The challenges that they face is that their environmental programs, which we see driving a lot of these corporate renewable procurement initiatives in multinationals, are less mature. And they haven't kind of got to large-scale renewables procurement yet. If you look at RE100, it still is fairly Western in terms of its sort of corporate bias. And so their exposure to the value proposition of renewables is less, because that whole kind of brand upside piece is reduced in Asia, and both B2B and B2C consumers aren't as sort of motivated by renewables as perhaps companies feel they are in the West. So they're closer, they know the markets better, but they're less likely to go hard at these issues. And so what a lot of these companies are doing is they're going and taking the the behind the meter option, and they're either procuring in the straight EPC contract and building their own systems, sometimes even using their own technical capability, and they're often building quite a lot. But when it comes to the offsite stuff, they tend to be fairly unengaged. So this group of companies, so far from what we're seeing, is not particularly active when it comes to pushing regulators to innovate on new procurement models. So second example are Western companies with a supply chain in Asia. So this would include a lot of the businesses that we see in the apparel sector and the electronics sector. These are businesses that, on the one hand, are driven towards Asian renewables procurement because they understand there's a lot of risk from the environmental impacts in their supply chain, and it's not just energy and carbon. So they're motivated and investing to act on that. They've learned lessons from their own operations about renewables procurement, so they've got models that they're interested to expand into Southeast Asia. And they'll be driven perhaps by public commitments like science-based carbon targets, which are really forcing them into Scope 3 carbon emissions, which means into reducing carbon emissions that they don't directly control. And for many companies, that means into their upstream supply chain. The challenge is, though, is that they're essentially trying to work with companies that they don't own and operate to make renewables procurement decisions. And so a lot of their ability to do this depends upon the quality and scale of their relationship with their suppliers. And so in the case of, say, Apple and Foxconn, where obviously that's a multi-billion-dollar annual relationship, it's a relatively easy process for one company to talk to the other company about renewables procurement. But most supply chains are a lot more fragmented than that. And we find that really a big challenge for a lot of the Western brands is their ability to have a large-scale conversation with a large number of suppliers about particularly on-site PV, but other renewables opportunities. The suppliers will come back and say, well, how can you make this easier for us? How can you make it more affordable? And that's a challenge at the moment because we don't yet have robust, scalable business models or services or supporting institutions that are helping brands to do that. So, this is very much a space that's moving at the moment, and I think will be important. Probably the apparel sector will move first to develop models whereby, we can see systems, PV systems of, say, 500 kilowatts to a megawatt deployed repeatedly across large numbers of suppliers with some kind of structure in the middle that makes it worthwhile for the supplier to do that. But at this point in time, we don't actually have a lot of examples of that. It's still very much early phase. So on-site is challenging, and the because of the sheer number of factories that you will get in your supply chain. And so this is a group that is particularly interested in new procurement models, because that's the only way that they're going to get the scale that their science-based targets and other public commitments need. So a lot of the innovation that we see at the moment is being pushed by Western supply chain style companies. And then the final group I thought I'd talk about was multinationals with owned and operated infrastructure in Southeast Asia. So food and beverages, automotive would be a couple of examples there. Obviously, these guys are in a similar position to the supply chain brands, in that they've got public-facing commitments and strong corporate programs driving them to procure more renewables. And they've often done a lot of procurement in the West. So they've successfully realized some substantial business benefits, often in the US, that they want to see if they can roll out across the rest of their company. The challenges that these companies face, really, what we've seen is a couple of things. One, when they delegate to local business units, in other words, they shift the responsibility for renewables procurement either on-site or off-site to local business units, the lack of capacity and familiarity with the technology and the procurement process is raising major barriers, and we're seeing some very, very strange RFPs and things like that kicking around when that happens. On the other hand, when the corporate tries to say, okay, we're going to drive this globally from a sort of a centralized procurement team, there we often find that the process isn't sufficiently flexible to take into account the different market conditions in Southeast Asian markets, for example, which can be quite diverse. And so there's quite a lot of challenges there. A lot of these businesses are still researching their best options, and so they're sort of screening sites and putting together priority packages that they can then structure more focused procurement initiatives around. To date, they tend to have been pretty over-optimistic about the off-site options, so there is this kind of sense that we'll be able to do PPAs in many other countries, and that's still looking like it's going to be challenging in the next, say, 3 or 4 years at any kind of scale. And so the scaled on-site model may be the best option for these companies in the short term. I think I'll just leave it there. I just wanted to put this perspective in because it's important to understand that the corporate perspective is not the same, the needs are not the same, and the project options that are being pursued in the region are quite different depending upon where the company is coming from. So we're getting a couple more questions on you know, how likely and soon PPAs are going to come to market in countries like Vietnam. I think what we'll do is we'll go on to our next section, which will address that in a bit more detail. So back over to you again, Alex.
Great, thank you. Let me go to the next slide. So as we get into some opportunities for engagement. So I mentioned the Clean Energy Investment Accelerator. This is a partnership, again, with World Resources Institute, Allitrope Partners, and the U.S. National Renewable Energy Laboratory. And it's really, you know, it starts with sort of building the demand. How do we build the demand from the large commercial industrial users in country? What are the models that make it more attractive for them, make renewables more accessible to that target segment? How do we shift that demand from the status quo offer to clean energy in an affordable, cost-effective way? In doing that, we attract new financial models and financing into the markets and financial solutions to further help make those procurement models more cost-effective. And then we work very closely with governments, with regulators, to inform better policy. And the thing here is this is really an economic development case that we can make with the government of Vietnam or Indonesia, where we're saying, look, you know, these companies are investing a lot in your country. They'll invest more in your country if they can access clean energy as well in an affordable way. And that is, you know, attracts investment. It's good for the environment. It's good for the economy. It's sort of a win-win-win. And we found that, again, government is very open to this conversation. So that's a good thing. And there are a couple approaches. I'm going to talk about one strategy that we've been using on how we improve economies of scale for companies. We can just go to the next slide. So one thing is through demand aggregation. So, you can look at charts of looking at solar, project size and cost. The larger the solar project, the cheaper it is, right? Everybody knows that. So what we've been trying to do is, rather than have, a number of companies in a city or in an industrial park or in a region kind of go out individually to do RFPs, WRI and now the Clean Energy Investment Accelerator help sort of aggregate that demand and sort of bundle that demand together. We do some work to do some site selection, some analysis on the site, some data collection. We actually have done some joint RFP development. We can run through the bid process and make sure we're getting good, well-designed proposals from the market. We do outreach to suppliers to inform them of the opportunity to attract the best suppliers into the market to provide their bids. And what we found is this kind of group purchase of solar has resulted in it improves transaction size, which reduces transaction costs for the vendor, right? So they get a larger pipeline, they get a group of sort of pre-qualified buyers who are going through the process at the same time. It improves economies of scale for them, which then translates into improved pricing for the buyers. So this kind of a model is very interesting. And I'll just show you the next slide. And in surveying the suppliers who've been involved in these group RFPs, in the hardware installation services and sort of other categories, the responses have been, in hardware, there's some opportunity for savings, but the global panel market, panels are panels. I mean, there's some price efficiencies there, but mostly it's in installation services, O&M, and other things that they really see big opportunities. So this is sort of an attractive model, especially in a new market, like sort of a new developing market, right, where you're trying to get some momentum going and attract new suppliers into the market. This is a nice way to do that. And so we have run these kinds of group procurement RFPs in the US and India, and we're now doing it in Colombia. We're working with 7 companies who can aggregate up to about 10 megawatts. 20 developers have responded to the RFP, and the initial pricing estimates are very attractive. So this is a model that we'll be looking to explore again as part of the CEIA, both in Vietnam and Indonesia, to sort of help create some scale in the market. Next slide. So in particular, in both Vietnam and Indonesia, we talked about opportunities for companies to get involved in helping to shape the renewable energy market in country. So Vietnam, we've launched a corporate buyers group in 2017. We'll be exploring kind of aggregation approaches. As Liam talked about supply chain challenges, we've got a supply chain focused working group in the apparel sector. We've been working with Liam and his team with the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, Race to the Top, and others. WRI's Science-Based Targets group has been involved. The science-based targets are essentially supply chain scope 1, 2, and 3 targets that are set by companies, which includes supply chain emissions. So kind of trying to engage suppliers on the implications of what a science-based target means for them. And then exploring solutions in country. So again, we talked about the direct power purchase agreement pilot, getting suppliers involved in that pilot program, some of these demand aggregation strategies, helping suppliers get involved in some of these opportunities in country to help them access renewables and sort of build their capacity. So I just wanted to flag that we've got a meeting next week on the 26th. If you're interested in learning more about that, reach out to me, and I can connect you to the right people in country to follow up on getting you plugged into that meeting. And next slide. We also have a work group in Indonesia. So we've got a meeting coming up on October 3rd there. And again, looking at how do you do kind of aggregation of facilities to get that scale, input to regulation, again, to create that enabling environment. There's a statement of mutual aspiration, which the companies in Indonesia have been developing, which basically sends a demand signal. How much demand for renewable energy exists in Indonesia from the commercial industrial sector? We've never quantified that before. So this is an opportunity to quantify that and sort of get the government excited about this as an economic development opportunity. We'll be working on several policies ranging from on-site solar, the net metering policy, and the open access policy. Again, opening up opportunities to do off-site power purchase agreements. So October 3rd is the next meeting in Indonesia. So it's sort of two examples of possible collaborations that we can offer both in Vietnam and in Indonesia, where we would welcome more participation from any of you on the webinar to help us sort of inform the regulatory environment there and open up and kind of create the future that we all want to see, which is a regulatory environment that allows companies to access the economic benefits and the increasing positive economics of clean energy. So I think that takes us to the final Q&A. I don't know if that's shaken any questions loose.
So I think there's a couple of things. One, the PPA question. In Vietnam, Alex, what kind of time frame are we looking at for potential opportunities for corporates to sign off-site PPA?
Yeah. Predicting the policymaking process in Vietnam has been a little bit tricky. But we're anticipating over the next 2-3 months that pilot program should be available. And we can, if companies are interested in learning more about that pilot program and want to know more about the details, there have been a few opportunities to consult with the Vietnamese government and with ERA, with the regulator. And sometimes they have these consultation forums where they're looking to engage company of buyers in the private sector. So if you're interested in being part of that work group, let me know, and I can connect you into our partners who are working with the government to open up that program. But we anticipate the next 2-3 months, so soon, where you'll be able to access that pilot program.
Question on the Philippines. What are we seeing in terms of pool procurement opportunities in the Philippines?
So the Philippines is it's a more of a deregulated market. So I know there's a lot more activity in terms of private developers of solar. And there's some interesting opportunities. We have a team there that's looking at kind of pool procurement among government facilities, I think hospitals. So I can, if companies are interested in learning more about the Philippines, again, reach out to me and I can connect you to the team there. but there's a lot of activity in the Philippines again. I mean, a lot of very sophisticated suppliers there, and the market is a little more open. So some of these models do have some promise. It's still early days, but I'm happy to connect any listeners to our team in the Philippines to get more information.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions that talk about the attractiveness of what looks to be on-site projects in Vietnam and Indonesia. So I think one of the, in both of these countries, obviously the challenge with the on-site projects is that the tariff is pretty low in both of these countries. They're still carrying quite a lot of subsidy. Typical industrial tariff might be 7 to 8 cents. Maybe 9 cents, let's say 7 to 9 cents a kilowatt hour. And so that's making the economics of the on-site marginal, I would say. So I think, with a large system and cheap finance, as Alex is saying, we are getting that pretty much close to grid parity, or we'll get a payback of like 9 to 10 years on an on-site system in those countries. But that's going to be for self-consumption. So to one of the questions was talking about what can you do about non-production days and the lost electricity from systems on those days. The answer is in most of these countries right now, not a lot. On the other hand, when we go to somewhere like the Philippines, which is frequently paying 18 to 20 cents a kilowatt hour, it's not an issue, because the payback is excellent, even if you're only doing the self-consumption model. So self-consumption, I think, is very geography by geography and tariff driven. There is finance. To another question was asking about the availability of finance. Finance seems to be coming up everywhere. That doesn't seem to be a major problem. It's more connected towards the credit rating of the company or the owner than any concerns about particularly PV and other renewable energy systems.
Right. That's a key point, because one of the big motivations for Clean Energy Investment Accelerator is to bring in good credit off-takers into the market. So by working with the corporates, who often have much better credit than the utility, who's essentially financially almost basically bankrupt because of the subsidy issue. So we're trying to bring in better credit sort of off-takers, right? And then, as you said, there's lots of financing out there, but there wasn't enough kind of credit from the demand side. So by bringing in the credit, we can sort of spur the financing models, that get at that reduced cost.
And then the last question that we have is really makes a note that Thailand is the biggest generator of PV in the region. Quite true. Are you doing any work using your sort of multi-buyer model in Thailand?
Currently, we are not. So no. But there's a lot of learning that we can take from Thailand, and we actually are working with Thai-based companies who are in Vietnam, and to kind of take learnings from the Thai market to other markets. So I think Thailand can be a sort of an incubator of ideas, right, that we can then bring to other parts of the region.
Yeah, and Thailand at 10 to 12 cents a kilowatt hour is. The construction costs came a long way down recently. We're probably 6 to 7 year payback for on-site there now. So again, some options just to do it yourself while we wait for some of these more macro procurement options to open up. Alex, we're out of questions. Any last words?
Well, I hope we're out of questions, because we answered everything or didn't confuse people beyond the ability to ask questions. But this was a pleasure. It's always great to talk with other champions in the clean energy space. And again, I think this key point that the opportunities are emerging very fast in the region. The economics are very quickly becoming attractive, and the opportunities to really help drive an enabling framework to create the markets that allow renewables to be sourced at scale and affordably are very real. And so we look forward to working with you all on that, and hope to keep in touch and report back on progress maybe on next year's webinar.
Thank you very much, Alex and Liam. Thank you for your insights, sharing your insights. Early morning for you, Alex, and late evening for Liam. Thank you to all participants for joining us. I would just like to let you know that, as mentioned in the beginning of this webinar, we will have a second webinar focused on corporate renewable energy transition in China. So please add the dates to your calendars. It's exactly in a week, 9:30 Central European Time. So we will have the webinar with RE100 and our partners Act Renewable again. And as a last note, I would like to share our upcoming conferences in emerging markets. If you are interested in development and finance of solar PV in those markets, please feel free to check the websites, and we will be happy to see you at our conferences. Thank you all for being here, for being active, and yes, we will talk again in a week for our next webinar. Thank you and goodbye.